And we are off.
Yeah, here's our second episode of Rest and Awaken.
Yay! Happy to be here. Feels like it's been a
Hey.
long time.
Yeah, it has. I was trying to filter through what we should chat about because it feels like so much stuff has been happening.
It does feel like a lot of stuff has been happening. Think we settled on marriage, right? And the deconstructing of normative or traditional marriage.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe we start with how long we've been married and kind of go from there. So I first got married in 2000. So it'll be 23 years in September.
It's a long time.
Yeah, a long time. How about you?
I was married in 2009. Yeah, so we're 9 years behind you. So we'll be 14 years this June. It's a long time.
It's a long time. Yeah. And thinking about, just how much changes over the course of 10, 20 years. And I think, I know you and I have been talking about the last couple of years, just how much stuff has changed. Like, I think I don't know about you, but for me, like when I feel like something shifted when I entered into my 40s, like there was something different. I don't know if it's like female liberation. I don't know if it's like challenging more heteronormativity. Maybe it was like feeling exhaustion and rage, like cycling through my life more and thinking like there's got to be a way to not feel so exhausted and to not feel so much rage.
Absolutely. Well, so many different points in marriage, right? I think there is something unique about our 40s. And for me specifically, there was something about my kids being a little bit older. And so feeling like there was more room to think rather than just survive every single moment. There was more room to reflect. But even thinking about the shift before we had children to when we had children, I felt so happy in my marriage pre-children. And then we had children, and it was just this enormous shift that it's not just the children, it's how the kids impact how we connect and relate to one another. And that was another really profound shift. So quite the adventure.
Yeah. It's interesting. Yeah, I feel like I have distinct memories about like pre-kids. And then I remember like the years of surviving.
Yeah.
And then and I remember being really attached as a new mom, as a young mom, to like doing things in a particular way. And doing things in that particular way often had me taking the lead in things. And like while I worked outside the home and was like the mother of two, and I think at that part of my career when I was building my career, it felt like I feel like there are layers of onions I've had to peel back over the years of like, no, you don't have to do this. Like you don't even like doing this. Like maybe you shouldn't do this. And the wrestling with, seeing that my mom like also took the lead in certain things and wanting to like either do the same or do it better. And then like how that made me not share some of the responsibilities with my spouse.
And that script I felt like the script that we get about what it means to be a good mother when we're so new and we have no time to think and we're not sleeping well. So it's almost a setup for us to be asleep and to just go through these motions, and this invisible script and this unconscious narrative, those are the things that were guiding me. But I've also got this new script of I'm a business owner. And so I'm like, I'm really ambitious and excited about all of that. So these things it was such a mess at the beginning. And I'm still peeling back. Why am I room coordinator for the 4th year in a row? How did that happen? Exactly.
Right.
and these competing priorities of I became a business owner because I wanted to be able to prioritize my family. I wanted and needed the flexibility so that I could go on field trips and, prioritize and be there every morning for breakfast and every night for dinner time. And it's great to have that freedom, but it's like I still have choice now. That doesn't mean that just because I created this business to give me more flexibility and choice and freedom doesn't mean I have to be the room coordinator every year. So what aligns with my priorities and my desires? Yeah, it feels really complicated.
Yeah, it's interesting. I remember going through a phase of being like the room coordinator, and then either I think probably my kids aged out of doing that stuff, and they're in 7th and 9th grade now. And I remember like there was a period of time when my spouse stayed home with the kids. It was probably maybe 4 or 5 years. And I remember like at that point of my career, I was doing a lot of intensive trainings. So I would go for a weekend to do this intensive training or something. Or I would, when I was going through my yoga certification, that was like a couple weekends a month of doing that. And having to sort through the stories in my head of you're away from home too much, right? And so the shift though last year, I think I've said to some of my close friends was that last year was the loneliest married year I had in the 20 something years. It was the loneliest. And I was trying to figure out why that was.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that I've loved in the last couple of years is being more in tune with my body and my nervous system. And so, it's like every winter I would get so exhausted. And I was like, wow, my body's telling me I really need to hibernate in the winter. I need to not commit to so many things, or my body doesn't like shifting gears in the day. It doesn't like to do therapy in the morning and then workshops in the afternoon and then billing. It doesn't like to do all of that shifting, and how much effort it took to tell myself it's okay to do less. So I think last year my kids, they take the bus to school. They are of they can stay home after school by themselves. Right. They aren't involved in as much sporting activities. So, so then I had more free time. I was working less intentionally. My kids didn't need me in the same way anymore. And my husband and I had spent probably a couple of years just running around, taking kids to practices and events and and there was the pandemic in there and all this stuff. And so I was like, oh, I need to put effort into addressing this loneliness. What is this loneliness about? And what do I need to pivot or recalibrate in my marriage, in my own life as a psychologist, business owner, consultant, parent, all of that stuff. So it was definitely a year of awakening. And with that comes agita and pain and potential suffering until I have those aha moments and I'm willing to make different choices.
Can I ask a question about something you just said? You said ahajana. Is that what you said?
Agita.
Ajna. Okay, can you tell me what that means?
Yeah. For me, it's the churning that happens inside of me when my body or my heart is saying, a little voice that's saying something's not right. You have to make a change and you're probably not going to like it. Those are the words I would put to the bodily experience. And I feel there have been different times in my life where that voice or that bodily sensation is there. And it's only in the last several years that I'm willing to listen to that voice, right? It's I've allowed the other humming and noises to decrease so that I can hear what my gut is telling me, right? What's the vibe, or that sometimes I don't know the full thing anymore, but I've listened enough to say, this part of me is important and I need to make space for it.
Oh my gosh, that in and of itself could be a whole thing that we go down in terms of, say that word one more time.
Agita, which I feel is I don't know. I feel like it's maybe comes from Jewish tradition. I don't know. I feel like I've heard other people say it. So it'll be interesting to hear what people say.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because I feel like that is such a good description of what I've probably been experiencing since my children were born. And then all of these like powerful gender roles and expectations about mom versus dad really came into play and started affecting my marriage. But my ability to gaslight myself, to get really caught up in very real things when our kids are little, right? Life is so busy and chaotic, and you have to be really intentional about paying attention. And if you're not, it's very easy to not do, right? So I think I spent the first several years of my kid's life not paying attention to that churning. And really, the pandemic started to slowly peel it back, and it happened slowly and then happened all in a hurry. And I mean, you know this, Natalie, but in December of 2021, that's when I told Nick I wanted a divorce. And at the time, I said it was because I was queer. But the more I sat with that and the more Nick and I talked through it, that wasn't just an easy out, because I was like, I need all of these things from Nick, and Nick's amazing. And I have no confidence I'm ever going to get these things from Nick. And if I'm not going to get it from Nick, I have no confidence I'm going to get it from any man. So I just need to give up on men and be with women. And so it's really been the last year and a half of Nick and I looking at every single aspect of how we partner or how we don't, and figuring out how can it be different. And it's just, it is constant.
Yeah. I would say like I had this kind of like parallel thing of like, yeah, like around last May when I was like, oh, like I'm more sad this year than I have been in previous years. And I was like, you know, my birthday's in January, and I was like, oh, this wasn't the best. And like, you know, there would be like Mother's Day came and went. I was like, and I just like the churning just kept coming. And I was just like, and like I would say like my nervous system tends to be maybe a little bit more depressive. Like I don't tend to get depressed, but I have a more depressive nervous system. Right. So, and I think I have a lot of strategies so that I don't get depressed, but like, I think those little hints of like, oh, I'm a little bit more sad, or I'm a little bit more tearful when I'm watching these shows or watching these movies, like something is like touching me. And so, yeah, starting to talk to Chris, my spouse, about, well, I don't know if we should stay married. Like, I don't know if this works. And to begin to have those conversations with him, but also with myself of like, what do you need? Like, is it that your marriage is finished? Right? Like it was a good 20 years, and, you know, with its normal ups and downs, and maybe you need to explore more of your queer side. Maybe you just need to be by yourself. Like maybe, you know, what would it look to deconstruct heteronormativity? Like, are there other options you can stay together, but maybe, you know, open the marriage or explore different things, like what's not working? And it requires like really honest conversations. And it's interesting, we were telling some family members about just like what was awakening in our marriage and like some of the hard conversations we were having, you know, and they're like firmly committed to us staying together. Yeah, of course, right? And so one of the family members said, you know, I'm just not progressive enough to, you know, be supportive. And that it was so true, and it was hurtful, right? So this idea of like, when we're talking about it's not working, like it's actually creating a healthier relationship. But for other people who live more in the binary, it's more like, you know, it's either you're married or you're not married. And there's nothing that's nuanced in well, maybe in the next chapter of our marriage, it's just going to look different. And like, we're going to play around with different things. And maybe that means like, we don't share the same bedroom every day because maybe we sleep much better when we're not in the same bed. Like I've started to snore in the last couple of years, which I didn't even know about till my kids told me on vacation, right? And like, they're just like when you have different like rhythms of like early awakening or going to bed late. So it's just like, if I imploded or exploded all and begin again, what would it look like in the 40s, 50s, 60s that maybe I would never have imagined in the first 20 years of marriage?
That's right. And I have found the willingness to let it all burn, right? We're still married, to the listeners who don't know that we're still married, but my willingness to let it all burn, and then Nick and I walking toward that possible outcome, and all of the honesty that was required during that time, because we were really committed to make sure that we were doing it in a very divorcing in a way that had integrity and was conscious and, you know, put our kids first, etc. So we had to talk about so many things, but the willingness to let it all burn was like, we can do whatever the fuck we want. And it was, we almost woke up to that reality. We've always been able to do whatever the fuck we want, but the amount of times that I forget that I'm a grown ass person who gets to do whatever I want and no one is the boss of me. I am constantly forgetting that. So it was fascinating at that time to explore. It's like, okay, maybe it's not divorce, but maybe we do live in separate houses. Well, what would that be like? And or maybe we do live in separate rooms, or and while we're no longer considering those giant changes, I always want to be awake enough to say, when I do notice that churning, how can we reimagine? That's really outside of the box. And that feels exciting and freeing to me so much, and Nick as well. But I forget how intimidating or scary that can feel for people witnessing it, and how rejecting people can be of that. So it has such liberty, like claiming freedom for ourselves has incredible power that I wasn't fully aware of until we started having these conversations with friends and family.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it makes me think about if more people were supported in like building the relationship that would most serve them, whether that's marriage or not marriage, or ethical non-monogamy, or like opening marriages, whatever it may be, that if more people would stay together, right? So I think about like, can one person meet all of your needs? Probably not. So then like this idea of heteronormativity, that you're going to be in this monogamous relationship with this one person for decades, seems like a recipe for failure. Absolutely. If you don't decide to, as in the different seasons of that relationship, to reimagine how it could be. And so I remember what was scary, probably, and painful earlier this year was probably like mid-February, when we told our kids that we were trying to reimagine our marriage, or like how we were going to be in relationship with each other. Like that was so devastating for them. And yet we felt like it was so important to share with them and to say that we're going to be okay as a family. And they're good now, right? Because I think they were picking up on vibes, like something's different with mom and dad in the last like year or so. And so I think like that healthy communication between the two of us and then the four of us, I think really helped to like bring us into this new chapter. Now we're all doing well. Like we're all happy. We're all in the same house. Like we're planning vacations together. It's good. But I think about if we hadn't decided to talk about like some things aren't working anymore, we have to do this differently, and we have to decide if it's better to do it together or separate, and we're opting to do it together. And I think that saying yes again is so important, like saying yes again. You don't just say it once and then that's it. Like you say yes almost every day, or no.
All of that. And that's why it's just so unhelpful that we get this binary message, right? Where you're either divorced or you're happily married, and there's nothing else. And so we get this message that we can't even talk about the possibility of divorce. I imagine, what would marriage be like if we talked about marriage like it's a monthly contract or an annual contract? And I suggested this to Nick at some point. It feels like so many other toxic systems, marriage, monogamy, feels like all the other toxic systems, where it's like, if you're not constantly awake, it's like that treadmill that we talk about. It's like, if you're not very consciously and actively walking the other way, you will just get pulled forward. And the amount of times that happens for Nick and I, it's just more than I can count. So at one point I was like, on the first of every month, we need to have a conversation about like, do we want to stay married? Do we want to keep being together for the next 30 days? And there was so much anxiety in that for him, but I was like, no, this is freedom, because now we get to say the things that we're not supposed to say, that we're actively discouraged from saying, and we have choice. So it's like this idea that talking about it means we still care. Not talking about it, even though that feels easier, is more likely to end us up not together. So
yeah, absolutely.
That's not the message we get.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think about in my group practice, we see a lot of requests for particularly women talking about sex, sexuality, sexual desire. We get a lot of requests for people wanting to explore ethical non-monogamy or polyamory, like opening their marriages or their relationships. So there's definitely a churning, a stirring, an awakening, I think, that's happening in parts of the country. And I think about, particularly for femme identifying people who have been told, that they can't, claim their sexuality like in an unapologetic way. I think like we're in a time where we have to support each other in being able to do that, that there isn't one right way of living an authentic, liberated life.
Absolutely. And I think I always viscerally remember this moment. You were doing a training with my business, and you casually said, "Oh, as a queer Black woman," I was like, "Oh!" And I emailed you or texted you afterwards. I was like, "You're queer?" And I know the more that I talk about being a queer woman married to a cisgendered heterosexual man in a monogamous relationship, the more I share that, the more women are like, "Oh, yeah, I mean, I like kissing girls, but I haven't since college." and the reluctance to identify as fluid, queer, bi, pan, whatever, but clearly there has been a curiosity or an interest and they are not just on the extreme end of straight. But I think about women, and the minute that you're married to a man, this powerful assumption that you're straight, that any part of your sexual identity that's anything other than straight gets erased even more so than when you were bi or pan and already pretty invisible. Yeah, it's so disappointing, because I would love to know more women. I think there's a lot of women.
I think so. Yeah. And I think even like I think about last year when I started just mentioning it to friends about like, just like there are parts of my life that I'm not as satisfied with anymore. And so, I was talking about work and like figuring out what I wanted to do work-wise, but then relationship. And then so many of my married friends said, yeah, like I'm like, there are things that I'm not so happy anymore. And it's like, but we weren't talking about it. But it was like, once I had the like vulnerability to like put it out there, I felt so affirmed, because there was actually very few people who were like, yeah, I'm like 100% happy. And I think about like, what are the things we're not talking about? Like that we feel like we have to keep a secret. And I wonder like how much like the social media world that has like people posting like the good about their life makes us not talk about the realness of our life, and that it's, not everything is happy all the time.
Absolutely. And especially at this phase that you and I are in, that I think is pretty typical actually for many reasons, right? Is that midlife, is that age of children, is that our own person, whatever.
Right. Yeah.
I really wish there was more room to actually talk about all the awakenings and the questioning that I think is really typical at this stage of marriage. But instead, the message is women who are married to men are often martyr themselves, often build anger and resentment. And then the way that they deal with that anger and resentment is they go out and they drink too much with their friends and they complain about their husbands and the lack of equitable distribution of labor, whatever, all these things. And they go out and they have like a wild night, and then they go back and everything stays exactly the same. And it's like, wash, rinse, repeat. But my experience is that when I was really honest with some people who I thought were really good friends, who we have honest conversations with, I mean, I've lost friendships over just being honest about the things that I'm thinking. So there's something really scary about that I wish I could better understand. Do you have any ideas? What are your ideas?
Yeah. Well, I forget who it was who said it. And I think they were talking about like gender fluidity, but like the quote stuck with me, but it was a variation of, if you have oppression that lives inside of you, right? So you have not been encouraged to be your most authentic, liberated self,
Right.
which might mean like pushing up against how you've been socialized in the binary, that it will be really hard to hold space for others who are living a liberated life, right? So when I think about like that, family member who was like, I'm not progressive enough, like I appreciated that they were able to name that it was something in them. But this idea of how scary, like I think about how scary it is to think about fluidity, to think about nuance, to think about moving away from the binary, like how threatening that is if that's not something that you do in your own life. And so I think for me, that's how I hold grace for people, is to think about how many people have been put into boxes, right, or have like gone down a path and they feel like they can't pivot. Like, I think one of the things that is hard for me is I really built a life where I try to have choices. And I mean, some of that is privilege that allows me to have choices, but like even choices inside my own head of like, what are the stories I'm going to tell myself? And like, what are actually barriers that I've put there that it's not society putting there? It's like me saying I can't do that, or I can't want that, or I can't take up more space. And so like having these really honest conversations with Chris around like, how can we make the role more equitable? Like all the things we share in parenting and just like managing a household, how can we make it more equitable? And what are the things I'm not going to do anymore? Because that part of me is finished, or like that season of my life is finished. And when I think about the loneliness of last year, I mean, part of how I helped myself like address it was I was like, I got so caught up in like managing, like being a business owner and all that stuff, plus parenting, that I let some of my friendships dwindle. Like they were still there in the distance, but they, so I was like, okay, like we're going to do monthly dinners together. So I was able to like figure out some of that stuff. And like, it's like, what are my hobbies again? Like, I mean, I feel like I've had more hobbies when I was younger. And Chris and I, for probably like even before we were married, we used to go, our goal was to see all the Major League Baseball stadiums together. Like each, well, to see each Major League Baseball team play at home, because they're always getting new stadiums and stuff. So that that completed last August. And so it was like, yay. And then it was like, well, what do we do together as a couple? Like we spent like 25 years doing this together. And so like last week I was like, maybe we need to develop a hobby together. Like maybe we go play pickleball. I've never played pickleball before, but I'm hearing words about it. Like, so I was like, I'm thinking about like, what do people do to make their marriage not become like boring? Yeah. Like how, like you have to say yes to being together in the versions you are now, right? Because like we had a strong foundation, but over time, the distance just grows in the relationship if we're not really showing up authentically and like doing the work to have the honest conversations.
So much, all of that. I'm taking a few things that I want to highlight for myself. One is that it's hard to get excited about somebody else flying if you're trapped in a cage.
Yeah.
And maybe you don't even know you're trapped in a cage. You just feel pissed when you see somebody else flying.
Yeah.
So that's a helpful thing for me to keep in mind. And this other thing about the intentionality that is required to stay in a monogamous long-term partnership and be happy and feel like you're not like wilting and just this endless every day is the same day. That does require so much intentionality. And I think about how, again, it's not just like one conversation, like, okay, we've got to be really intentional about spending time together. That again, every season is different. I was just telling you before we started, April is just the start of this really insane season in our lives where there's softball and baseball and end of the year school activities, because I've got 2 kids who are in elementary school. So it's just, and birthdays and whatever. And we've only been in it like less than a month, but already I'm a puddle. I was a puddle on Sunday morning and crying and overwhelmed. And when I was sitting with myself trying to figure it out, part of it is that Nick and I have not spent any quality time together in 24 days. And we've been so good and so intentional about that.
Right.
But it's like, right back, let's realize what's happening. We're in a different season of our lives, so it's gonna look different. We lost all of our babysitters this last fall because they all went to college. So it's like there's so many, it can't be like, oh, let's just have a date night. Right. All the labor of like, we've got to get more babysitters on, and then they probably got to come over when we're there to make the kid. But we had that conversation, which I'm grateful for. I'm holding lots of multiple truths in April. I'm grateful for that conversation. And I'm still frustrated that I'm the one that had to flag. We haven't really talked to one another in a meaningful way, any way that is a feeling of emotional intimacy in 24 days.
Right. Yeah.
Do you feel that? I feel that. Can we do something about that? How do we work together to make that difference?
Right.
Have to be so awake.
Yeah, it just shows how much we can be sleeping through or just in survival mode, especially when the culture gets to be in more of that hustle or that busyness, or just, our kids are involved in activities and, it's only for a season or so, but like in that time, you just shift into the survival mode. And like, what would it mean to pause, chat, reflect, make some adjustments?
Totally. And I've got ways that I have learned how to stay awake or wake back up and realize I've been asleep. And marriage is this especially challenging thing because I come from a long line of alcoholics and alcoholism. And so while neither of my parents were alcoholics, codependency was a huge, huge part of my upbringing. So I am in recovery from codependency. And so what I struggle with in my marriage is like, well, I know how to be awake or at least wake myself up or assess if I'm awake.
Mm.
But Nick doesn't.
Mm.
But Nick's being awake is not my responsibility, but I still have to deal with the consequences
Right. Yeah.
of him not being awake. So it's this delicate balance, maybe in a lot of marriages, not just marriages where people are struggling with codependency, of like, how much do I get to say about how awake you are? And if I'm not managing that or not talking about that, what are my options then in terms of feeling the consequences of your lack of awakeness?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
Ugh.
such a bind, because I think that so many like, femme identifying individuals are socialized to kind of do that emotional load or labor of like managing like the
Yep.
family calendar and the activities and all of that stuff. And I remember your April used to be my September. And particularly like the first day of school, like the days around the first day of school, it was like the shift from the summer to the school calendar. And I would be like my most rageful the evening of the first day of school for like
Yep.
years. And it was like all the paperwork you had to fill out. Back then it was like you had to write it all out, and then it was like just the logistics. Do they have all that they need? And then like making space for them to be ready. And I usually was working, and there was all this stuff. So every year I was like, okay, what can you do to make this better? What can you do? What can you hand off? Maybe you don't work that day, or maybe you only work a half a day. Like it was all of that stuff. And so I think about like just how hard it is to, like, if I think of men who are socialized to take a back seat to a lot of this planning, organizing doctor's appointments, like all the stuff. And how do we lovingly like communicate to them what we need, while also recognizing that it might take them a while because they have not built those muscles. They may not even be awake to like, oh, how do all these things get done? They don't just happen by accident, right? And so that I think about how that lives in our bodies, that mental load of thinking about planning all these things, and how do we begin to share that with other people or outsource it? If we have the ability to outsource it, how do we outsource it?
Yep. And the multiple truths of, I'm grateful that I have a partner who wants to learn, who, when therapists he's worked with have said like, you're doing an awful lot. When does Colleen start to like grow or bend a little? And he's able to say back, I don't need you to give me the easy out. I need you to push me. I need you to I'm so grateful that I have the partner that I do. And and I'm still the one that's usually scanning the horizon, right? And I have a lot of feelings about that. So it is the grace for him, and understanding that he's not been taught how to do this, and society in fact has taught him the opposite message, that this is not his responsibility.
Right, yeah.
And that's not his fault. And it's still frustrating, right? So many things to hold at the same time. And then I think, how does I wonder about and the intersection of race. And I wonder, and I'm married to a white man, and so there's the epitome of privilege and power and lack of awareness. And so there's so much there, and the ability to be grateful and hold grace, and still allow myself to be frustrated. It's a lot.
Yeah. And you talking about your family of origin made me think about, part of my awakening started in the fall of 2017, when my mom passed away of cancer. And it was cancer that she didn't know she had until the last like 2 or 3 weeks of her life. And that was like really like heartbreaking, but also I think the awakening that started in me is like, how did being a Black woman in this country lead to like a weathering effect? I mean, she was a nurse. So the fact that she didn't know that her body like was dying, speaks to maybe, some of her denial, some of her like the ways in which she pushed herself and the ways in which she just held pain and suffering and just thought like that's just the way that it is.
Yeah.
And she was only retired for 2 years before she passed away. And it made me think like, well, and she died at 66. So in my mind, it was like, well, if I keep living this life of hustle and busyness and like maybe shouldering more than I need to, and I know all the statistics about Black women and the ways in which they tend to like be these superheroes and like hold on to their pain and don't communicate and maybe do too much, and like how that has a weathering effect and like shortens your lifespan.
Mm-hmm.
That if I don't make some significant changes, either I won't live a longer life, or what am I going to do with the last like 20, 25 years?
Right.
Like, what am I going to do? Like, how can I do differently? How can I live longer than my mother if I can make some behavioral changes, if I can make some internal changes,
Mm-hmm.
which is, the ongoing thing. I think about how can I be a good ancestor, but also like, how can I think about what am I holding on to that I don't need to?
Mm-hmm.
Thinking like, because I remember those last few years before my mom retired, her body wanted her to retire, but she was like, I gotta reach, she worked for the VA. She's like, I gotta reach like, I don't know, 64 and a half or something like that, because I want to get my full pension or whatever. And then it's like, but then she only had 2 years to use it. Like, so like thinking about what's the best quality of life I can live now. And if I don't have to keep telling myself, well, I'll get to it in 5 years. I'll get to it when I achieve this next thing, because tomorrow isn't guaranteed.
Right. Oh, that's a heartbreaking story. But the lessons of our ancestors is something I've been thinking about a lot lately. It's probably a different thing, but I think it's fascinating. I think it's really important for when I started to think about what are the things that the women in my family have shouldered, that have caused them to either die early tragic deaths, lots of early tragic deaths with my ancestors, or live a very long time, but to your point, not a good quality of life, in part due to all of the things that they didn't have a lot of choice about just accepting in their lives. And that I am in a place in our family lineage where I have more privilege, more power, more access to resources. So how can I free myself, not just for me, but for them, so that we can all share in this? And then maybe we pass a different story down to my children. I think about especially my daughter when I think about all the women in my family. Yeah, it's a really interesting to think about. And for me, it intersects a lot with the kind of wife and mother I am, and how do I self determine what those things mean and how I show up in those roles in a way that society does not dictate. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
I felt like that was like
absolutely.
some ADHD.
Yeah, no.
web
It made total sense. Yeah, I
Okay.
think we can learn a lot from our ancestors and we can model something different for the next generation. And
Yes.
I think even if people around us are resisting or not supportive of us living a more liberated life, that like that continual story of like, that's not my problem. And I can feel the sadness or the grief, that they're not going to come along on the journey with me. And yet, perhaps I'm sprinkling in that there are other ways of being. And yeah, that's what I'm going to hold on to. That's what I'm going to take away from from this conversation is like, to be liberated takes work in a society that
Yeah.
doesn't want us to live that full authentic life, because it dismantles the patriarchy, dismantles, the hustle, white supremacy, capitalistic culture, and we can do better.
Totally. I'm forgetting who the original author of the quote was, and I don't even know the exact quote, but essentially it's like liberation is never one directional, right? That when you get free, you free somebody else. And that was my mantra as I was gearing up to talk to Nick, is that, I was like, maybe he's not happy either. Maybe he's gonna, I think I'm gonna devastate him, but maybe he's gonna be thrilled. And so I continue to hold on to that idea that even when it feels scary, when I'm like, people aren't gonna be happy about this, that someone is going to see it, and maybe a light bulb will go off for them about, like maybe I can do that too. Or what does that look like for me? Or I get to take a break. Oh my gosh, I didn't know I could. So that's really helpful in terms of fueling that bravery when it's not coming as organically. Ooh, lots of big steps.
Yeah. Well, it's always a pleasure chatting with you, for sure.
Same. I've been looking forward to it.
Me too.
See you next time.
Well, yeah, this is a wrap for Rest and Awaken episode 2.
Yeah. Do we know when we're coming back? Is it?
I think we're on next week.
Yeah?
Yeah, I think so.
All right. Awesome. Yay.
I'll see you then.
I'll see you then. All right. Bye.
Bye.
There we go.